Hospitals are places of healing, filled with doctors and nurses working tirelessly to save lives. But sometimes, within those sterile white walls, something else lurks, something that cannot be explained by science or reason. What I experienced at St. Vincent's Hospital was beyond horrifying. It was deeply disturbing. Welcome to Disturbia. I had been working as a night shift nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital for about 6 months when it happened. The hospital itself was old, with long, sterile hallways that always seemed too dimly lit, no matter how bright the overhead lights were. Something about it felt off. Patients spoke about things moving in the shadows, whispered voices calling their names at night. I always brushed it off as the medication talking, or the fever dreams of the delirious. But on this particular night, something changed. It started with room 306. An elderly woman had been admitted earlier that day, barely conscious and mumbling nonsense. Her family had been with her for a while, but by the time my shift started, they were long gone. I passed by her room during rounds and heard a sound that made me stop cold. A whisper. Not from her, though. From the darkness of the room. It was low, rasping, and unmistakably not hers. I stepped inside. "Mrs. Cartwright, are you awake?" I asked. Nothing. Just the rhythmic beat of the heart monitor. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The chair by her bed was rocking, slightly, almost imperceptibly. I swallowed hard and reached for the call button, but before I could press it, she gasped and sat bolt upright. Her eyes, milky and unfocused, locked onto mine. And then she whispered, "He's here." Before I could respond, her heart monitor let out a long, flat beat. Dead. That should have been the worst part of the night. But it wasn't. A few hours later, a patient on the 4th floor coded. Then another, and another. 3 deaths in one night, all in different wings, all within minutes of each other. The odds were impossible. I tried to keep myself together, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But then I heard it again. The whisper, low, rasping. This time, it was closer, right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the long, empty hallway stretching into the dark. I wasn't the only one who noticed something was wrong. Dr. Evans, one of the senior physicians, called an emergency staff meeting. He looked shaken, pale. He told us that all 3 patients who had died had one thing in common. Before their vitals failed, they all whispered the same thing. "He's here." At that point, panic was setting in. Security was called, but nothing was found. Still, the deaths didn't stop. It was then that we noticed something horrifying. The security cameras had picked up movement. A figure in black scrubs, face obscured by the angle of the cameras, moving from room to room. Always just moments before each patient died. We locked down the hospital. No one in, no one out. Then, the power went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie red glows down the hallways. My radio crackled to life with a whisper, not static, not interference. A voice. "I see you." I turned, heart hammering in my chest. And there, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure, tall, motionless, a scalpel glinting in his hand. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran, my shoes pounding against the tile floor. I turned down corridor after corridor, but no matter where I went, I could hear him behind me. Then I reached the morgue. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I realized my mistake. No other exits, just a room full of the dead. I turned to run, but it was too late. The door swung shut behind me, and I heard the soft click of the lock. A whisper in the dark. Time's up. I backed away, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The emergency lights flickered, and in their brief flashes, I saw him. Closer, closer. Then, something changed. A sound, loud and piercing. The hospital alarms. Security had found the body of one of their own, a guard killed in the stairwell. That meant the hospital was truly locked down, but it also meant they were looking for me. The killer turned at the sound, distracted, and that was all I needed. I lunged, grabbing a metal tray from a nearby counter and smashing it into his face. He stumbled back, and I took my chance, sprinting to the door, slamming my shoulder into it. Once, twice, then it gave way. I fell into the hallway, screaming for help. He was gone. Security found me moments later, bloodied, shaken, but alive. But the killer? Never found. That was 6 years ago. I quit working at St. Vincent's shortly after. Too many unanswered questions. Too many sleepless nights. The hospital still stands, still operates. But even now, there are whispers about the night shift. Patients who swear they see someone in the halls. Nurses who hear their names whispered when no one is there. And every now and then, someone else dies. No cause, no explanation, just a whisper in the dark. There are few places as terrifying as the inside of an ambulance. It's a place where life and death hang in the balance, where hope can slip away in an instant. But sometimes, death doesn't come naturally. Sometimes, it follows you, lurking in the shadows, waiting. What I experienced that night on duty was beyond horrifying. It was a nightmare that I'll never wake up from. I had been working as a paramedic for almost 4 years. I had seen a lot: car crashes, overdoses, gunshot wounds. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that night. It was a slow shift. One of those rare nights where the calls were spaced far apart, giving me and my partner, Jake, time to grab coffee and relax between runs. Around 2 a.m., we got a call that seemed routine. A man had collapsed in his apartment. No history of illness, no warning signs. Just dropped to the floor, unconscious. We arrived at the scene in minutes. The apartment was small, neat, but eerily silent. The man, mid-40s, lay on the floor, completely still. His wife stood in the corner, wide-eyed, wringing her hands. He just stopped breathing, she whispered. Jake and I sprang into action. CPR, oxygen, defibrillator, nothing. His pupils were blown. No heartbeat. It didn't make sense. People don't just drop dead like that without a cause. But when we checked his pulse one last time before declaring him gone, something strange happened. His mouth moved. Not like a reflex. Not a twitch. He whispered something. Jake and I leaned in, exchanging a glance. "What did he just say?" I asked. Jake shook his head. It sounded like, "He's coming." A chill ran down my spine. Then, just like that, the man was gone. No pulse, no breath, dead. We bagged the body, comforted his wife as best we could, and loaded him onto the gurney. Business as usual. But something about it didn't sit right. And then, the real nightmare began. Jake drove the ambulance while I sat in the back with the body. It was a short ride to the morgue, maybe 10 minutes. I kept my eyes on the monitor, watching for any strange post-mortem movements. Sometimes bodies twitch. Sometimes they release air. Nothing unusual. But then I felt it. A shift. Not like the ambulance turning. Not like hitting a bump. The gurney moved. I grabbed the metal rails, expecting an uneven road. But the ambulance was rolling smoothly. No sudden turns. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, hoarse, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "He's coming." I whipped around, staring at the body. It hadn't moved. The white sheet remained undisturbed, but the whisper had been right beside my ear. I pressed the intercom. Jake stopped the truck. Static. Then, the lights flickered. I turned back to the body. The sheet was shifting, rising, as if something was underneath, pushing upward. And then, the sheet collapsed. The body was gone. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The gurney was empty. "Jake!" I shouted. "Stop the truck now." No response. The ambulance rocked suddenly, jerking to the side as if we had hit something. The doors at the back rattled violently. I lunged for the intercom again. "Jake, do you hear me?" Silence. Then, a single guttural breath. Right behind me. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. And there, in the farthest corner of the ambulance, was the man. Standing. His eyes were completely black. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. His fingers twitched. He took a step forward, then another. I grabbed the defibrillator. "Stay back," I shouted, panic seizing my throat. He didn't stop. I slammed the paddles together, the machine sparking to life. "I swear to God, I'll use this." And then, he smiled. The ambulance screeched to a halt. The sudden force threw me forward, and when I hit the floor, I expected to feel him grab me. But when I looked up, he was gone. Vanished. I scrambled up and wrenched open the door to the cab. Jake! Jake wasn't there. The driver's seat was empty. The ambulance sat in the middle of an empty road, engine still running, hazard lights blinking. Jake was gone. I stumbled out into the night, heart pounding. I checked my phone. No service. The silence was deafening. I turned back to the ambulance, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. On the windshield, written in smeared red streaks, were the words, "He's already inside." A breath of air hit the back of my neck. Cold. Slow. I turned, but there was no one there. Then, the radio crackled to life. A voice. Distorted. Faint. "He's coming." And then, silence. Jake was never found. The police found no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no evidence that he had ever been in the ambulance at all. But I know what I saw, what I heard. He's coming. And one day, he'll come for you too. There are moments in life that change you forever. You go into a situation one person, and you leave it as someone else, someone you don't recognize. That's what happened to me. What I lived through, what I saw. I still wake up drenched in sweat, wondering if it was all real. But it was. And now, I have to tell this story because people need to know the truth about what's lurking behind the sterile walls of hospitals. It started when I was admitted to St. Augustine's Medical Center. I wasn't supposed to be there long, just a few nights for observation after a bad car accident. My leg was broken, a few ribs cracked, but nothing life-threatening. At least, that's what I thought. If I had known what was waiting for me, I would have crawled out of that place, broken bones and all. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. Hospitals always have an eerie vibe. Bright fluorescent lights that don't quite eliminate the shadows. The distant beeping of machines keeping people alive. But this was different. The nurses moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. The other patients seemed restless, whispering to each other in hushed, fearful tones. And then there was the doctor, Dr. Kane. That was his name. Tall, thin, with a gaunt face that looked almost skeletal under the harsh hospital lighting. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was just a little too soft, like he was always hiding something. When he examined me, his fingers were ice cold. He asked the usual questions about my injuries, my medical history, my pain levels. But then he started asking other questions. Do you live alone? Do you have any family in the city? Has anyone else visited you? At first, I thought he was just making conversation. But the way he watched me as I answered, like he was calculating something, it made my stomach twist. That first night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, telling myself I was overthinking. But then, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like forever before moving away. I wanted to convince myself it was just a nurse making rounds, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Discovering the truth. The next day, a nurse came in to check my four. She was young, maybe early 20s, and she had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. When she leaned in, her voice was barely a whisper. You need to get out of here, she said, not looking at me directly. My skin went cold. What? Why? She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she adjusted the four line. Dear Kane, he's not who you think he is. Before I could press for more, she rushed out of the room. I needed answers. That night, I forced myself to stay awake, and that's when I saw it. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the sounds. The squeak of a gurney rolling down the hall. The faint metallic clinking of surgical tools. I shifted in bed, careful not to make any noise, and peered through the crack in my door. Dr. Kane was there, pushing a patient on a gurney down the hall. The patient wasn't moving. At first, I thought they were asleep, until I noticed the restraints on their wrists and ankles. My blood ran cold. I had to know where he was taking them. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slid out of bed, ignoring the pain in my broken leg, and crept after him. He turned a corner, heading toward a part of the hospital that looked abandoned. The walls were grimy, the lights flickering, the kind of place no patient should be. I followed him to a door at the end of the hallway. It had a keypad, but before he entered, I caught the code. 4 to 7, 1 to 2. He disappeared inside. I waited until he was gone, then limped over. My fingers trembled as I punched in the code. The door unlocked with a soft click. What I saw inside still haunts me. It was a makeshift operating room, but not the kind meant for saving lives. Rusty surgical tools covered in dried blood. Jars lined the shelves, filled with things I don't even want to describe. And the worst part, bodies. Some still breathing, barely. Others, too late. In the middle of the room, strapped to the table, was the patient Dr. Kane had taken. Their eyes darted around wildly, mouth gagged. They were awake. I had to do something. A sudden noise made me spin around. Dr. Kane was standing in the doorway, his head slightly tilted, like he was amused. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. My heart pounded. I backed up, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. My hand found a scalpel on the tray beside me. "I saw what you did," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm going to tell someone." He sighed, almost disappointed. "You won't get the chance." And then he lunged. Adrenaline took over. I swung the scalpel, catching his arm. He hissed in pain, but it barely slowed him down. I dodged past him, bolting for the door. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. Down the hall, past the empty rooms, toward the nurse's station. I screamed for help. A security guard rounded the corner just as Dr. Kane caught up to me. I braced for the worst, but then the guard tackled him. The police came. The hospital was locked down. They found everything: the hidden room, the bodies, the evidence of what he'd been doing for years. Dr. Kane was arrested, but his smile never faded. As they dragged him past me, he whispered, "I'll see you again." It's been months now, and I still don't sleep through the night, because sometimes I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my door, and I swear I still hear his voice. If you're ever in the hospital, pay attention to the doctors, because sometimes the ones meant to save you are the ones you should fear the most.